For well over a century, the line separating the United States and Canada wasn't just the longest undefended border on Earth.
Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Donald Trump declaring on social media that he's officially called off trade talks with Canada.
It served as the foundation of one of the closest, most reliable, and most lucrative economic relationships ever built. Two nations, one shared production system, two flags, one interconnected power network, two governments, one unspoken understanding. You don't destroy a home you both rely on. Then, within a matter of months, Donald Trump disrupted that balance. When he publicly suggested the idea of bringing Canada in as the 51st state and imposed steep 25% tariffs on one of America's closest partners, much of the mainstream media treated it like another passing moment of political drama. They skimmed through his Truth Social posts, heard him refer to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney as a potential governor, and largely brushed it aside. But what many missed was what followed. Mark Carney didn't respond with a routine diplomatic statement. He didn't appeal emotionally or ask for restraint. Instead, he initiated a precise and strategic shift away from reliance on the United States, a calculated effort to redraw economic ties. And in doing so, he secured billions in trade opportunities, tourism gains, and increased leverage on the global stage. If you're looking for clear, direct facts without the usual distractions, make sure to subscribe now, because this situation is moving faster than most outlets can keep up with. By the time you finish this report, you'll understand how Trump's pressure campaign on Ottawa sparked a major countermove, why communities along the U.S. border and American taxpayers are now absorbing the consequences, and the one key figure that completely changes how this story is viewed. To really understand the scale of what has happened, you need to step back and recognize what the United States and Canada represent to each other. This isn't just about neighboring countries or friendly allies. In practical terms, they have functioned as a single, deeply integrated economic system. If you've ever driven a car manufactured in North America, the components inside likely crossed the U.S.-Canada border around 7 times before the vehicle was completed. 7 separate crossings. A steering column might begin in Ontario, move to Michigan for assembly, return to Windsor for finishing, and then head back to Ohio to be installed. It operates like a living circulatory system. The Ambassador Bridge, which connects Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario alone, carries about $400 million in trade every single day. Just one bridge. Around a quarter of all goods exchanged between the two countries pass over that single connection spanning the Detroit River. The power grid in the American Northeast is tightly linked with hydroelectric energy from Quebec. U.S. farming depends heavily on fertilizer supplied by Canada. These economies aren't simply side by side. They are interwoven at the smallest levels. For decades, leaders in Washington, regardless of party, recognize this reality. You don't tamper with the core structure that supports your own system. Disagreements happened, whether over dairy limits or lumber trade, but no one seriously threatened the foundation itself. Then came Donald Trump's return, bringing a sharp and unprecedented escalation. Early in his administration, the direction was unmistakable. The America First approach intensified, and Canada was placed squarely in focus. The government introduced a sweeping 25% tariff on imports from both Canada and Mexico, a full 25% charge. To put that into simple terms, this is not a fee paid by Canada to the United States, despite how it's often described. A tariff is paid by American companies, bringing those goods into the country, and those costs are quickly passed on to consumers. It effectively becomes an added tax on everyday purchases, set in motion by policy decisions from the White House. Yet it wasn't only the economic measures that unsettled observers around the world. It was also the tone, the intentional public belittling of a long-standing ally. During a widely covered and unusually tense meeting at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump reportedly told Canadian officials that if Canada couldn't satisfy his demands on border control and trade imbalances, they might as well consider becoming the 51st state. He even joked that Canada's Prime Minister would serve well as a governor. The media jumped on it immediately, replaying the clips nonstop and filling panels with debates about his tone and style. Many framed it as bold, aggressive negotiation tactics. Inside Washington, the belief was already set in stone, deeply embedded in the administration's approach to trade. Canada would eventually give in. The logic seemed straightforward. Canada's economy is about 1/10 the size of the U.S. economy. They depend on American markets far more than the U.S. depends on them. More than 75% of Canadian exports go south of the border. So the thinking was, if the United States turned up the pressure high enough, threatening to cripple their export-driven economy while publicly challenging their sovereignty, Ottawa would have no option but to fold, return to negotiations, and accept whatever terms were put in front of them, no matter how unfavorable. That was the strategy. But it relied on an outdated understanding of how Canada would respond politically, and that misjudgment turned out to be massive. If this breakdown is helping you see past the headlines, hit like, because what happened next didn't unfold under the spotlight of Mar-a-Lago. To understand why the White House approach failed so badly, you have to look at who they were actually dealing with. The administration acted as if they were still pushing around a cautious, consensus-focused Canadian leadership that would avoid confrontation at all costs. But Ottawa had changed. The person now in charge was not a traditional political figure focused on image or diplomacy. It was Mark Carney. Carney isn't someone who gets rattled by loud rhetoric or public pressure. He's a central banker, a strategist shaped by years of handling financial crises at the highest level. He led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 global financial meltdown while major American institutions were collapsing. His performance was so respected that the United Kingdom later brought him in to head the Bank of England, making him the first non-British leader in its 300-year history. This is someone who understands leverage, economic pressure points, and global markets better than most. So when Trump rolled out the 25% tariff threat and made remarks about Canada becoming another state, Carney didn't react emotionally. He didn't rush to cameras or issue dramatic appeals about friendship between nations. He shifted into action. The first clear sign that everything had changed came in January at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Traditionally, Davos is where leaders promote unity and cooperation. But Carney used that stage differently. He delivered a message aimed directly at Washington, and it was firm, controlled, and unmistakably defiant. Analysts later began calling it the Davos Doctrine. In that speech, Carney made it clear that Canada would no longer operate as the dependent partner in the relationship. He stated plainly that Canada does not exist because of the United States. It was a sharp and public signal that the old dynamic was over. He laid out a new direction, one where Canada would protect itself from being exposed to unpredictable decisions coming out of the White House. If the United States chose to treat Canada like a rival instead of a partner, then Canada would respond in kind. That meant expanding trade relationships beyond North America, strengthening ties with Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and even exploring partnerships that Washington might find uncomfortable. It was more than a speech. It was a declaration of a strategic shift, a message to global markets that reliance on the U.S. was no longer guaranteed and that supply chains needed to adapt. Back in Washington, the reaction was dismissive. Officials saw the Davos remarks as political positioning, something meant to reassure Canadian voters after a tense moment. They believed the pull of the American economy was too powerful for Canada to move away from, regardless of what was said on an international stage. The expectation remained that sustained pressure, especially through the 25% tariffs, would eventually force Canada to back down. But this is exactly where the situation takes a different turn. What the Trump administration didn't fully grasp about the person they were confronting and the country they were pressuring was this. Mark Carney's real leverage wasn't a speech delivered in Switzerland or a show of diplomatic strength. It was the quiet, calculated actions he set in motion behind the scenes. The strategy coming out of the White House assumed a traditional government-to-government clash. What they failed to see was that Carney was preparing something different. He was ready to activate the very force Donald Trump often praised, the influence of everyday consumers. Instead of relying solely on standard retaliatory tariffs, Carney moved in a direction no one in Washington had anticipated. Rather than simply matching tariffs on products like steel or dairy, which many expected, he allowed and encouraged a nationwide shift in behavior. Through a coordinated wave of messaging and public sentiment, Canadians were effectively told, if the United States no longer values the partnership, then it doesn't need Canadian spending either. Almost immediately, what had once been a quiet buy Canadian mindset turned into something much stronger, a broad, informal economic response driven by citizens themselves. And the real impact didn't stay within Canada. It hit hardest at the border. For decades, communities along the U.S. border, from Maine all the way to Washington state, have depended heavily on Canadian visitors. Places like Buffalo, Bellingham, and Burlington built entire local economies around weekend traffic coming from across the border. Canadian shoppers would come down for fuel, retail chains like Target and Costco, and short hotel stays. In many of these towns, Canadians made up close to 30% of total retail activity. But after the rhetoric about the 51st state and the introduction of steep tariffs, that steady flow suddenly dried up. There was no need for a formal policy to enforce it. The tone coming from Washington had already changed behavior. What followed was immediate and severe. By March 2026, retail sales in several U.S. border regions had dropped by roughly 40%. Shopping centers that were already under pressure became nearly empty. Small businesses, many of which had supported the America First approach, found themselves facing declining revenue and growing financial strain. The realization came quickly. You don't just push away a neighboring country, you push away one of your biggest customer bases. As the situation worsened, the effects spread beyond retail and into manufacturing. Those auto parts moving back and forth across the border, sometimes up to 7 times during production, now faced a 25% tariff each time they re-entered the United States. That dramatically increased costs. Producing vehicles like the Ford F-150 or Chevrolet Silverado suddenly became far more expensive. Automakers were left with 2 options: absorb the losses or raise prices. They chose the latter. Consumers felt the impact almost instantly as vehicle prices climbed sharply, placing additional strain on American households. This is where the policy revealed its contradiction. A move intended to strengthen domestic industry ended up increasing costs for the very consumers it was meant to protect. By the time spring arrived around the Great Lakes, concern had spread into Washington itself. This wasn't just criticism from one political side. Governors from Midwestern states, many of them aligned with the administration, began raising alarms behind closed doors. Their states depended heavily on Canadian trade and energy, and the economic data was becoming impossible to ignore. Job losses were beginning to appear, and pressure was building. At the same time, Carney was taking another step that raised even more concern. He was actively engaging with the European Union and a group of mid-sized economies to form new trade arrangements that would reduce reliance on the United States. His approach wasn't just defensive, it was forward-looking. By finding alternative markets for Canadian oil, agricultural products, and key minerals, he was demonstrating that Canada had options. The message was clear. While the U.S. market remains powerful, it is no longer the only viable path, especially if it becomes unpredictable. And that brings us to the single number that reshapes the entire story, the one figure that changes how all of this is understood. That number is 82%. That's the portion of the U.S. trade deficit with Canada made up of critical energy supplies and raw materials, resources the United States can't just replace overnight or suddenly produce domestically. By pushing this economic brake, the Trump administration didn't just put tariffs on Canadian imports. They effectively increased costs on the very oil, metals, and inputs needed to support the industries they were trying to protect. The consequences quickly escalated into a rare moment of urgency in Washington. What followed was something you don't often see, a bipartisan pushback in the U.S. Senate. Figures like Chuck Schumer, along with several lawmakers who had previously supported Trump's agenda, began working on emergency measures to reassess the tariff system. The goal was clear: prevent further damage to their own state economies, many of which were already feeling the strain. It was a significant moment, signaling that the strategy had run into a hard economic reality that couldn't be ignored. So where does that leave the situation now? The physical border between the two countries hasn't changed, but the relationship behind it has. The attempt to pressure Canada as if it were a negotiable asset didn't lead to deeper control or influence. Instead, it pushed Canada toward a more independent and strategically distant position than it has held in generations. Mark Carney didn't just respond, he adjusted the entire playing field, showing that in a connected global economy, leverage depends on mutual reliance. And Canada demonstrated that its reliance was no longer one-sided. This story is still developing, and the long-term impact, especially the financial burden now being felt by American consumers, is far from settled. Stay tuned and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more updates as this continues to unfold.